So if you already know that fiber optic cables will get pulled enough where they would snap, and electric lines, I know there's some elasticity built into that. But if you're going to think about something moving half a mile or a quarter mile, snap. Okay, they're already pre-planning in that they're going to need to have movable power everywhere to still have some semblance of society, knowing that what we consider traditional infrastructure might have to shift drastically in the way you deliver power or goods to cities if the above ground conduits aren't working. What's your plan B and then plan C?
Now, Russia has a lot of other non-nuclear icebreakers, but looking here on this thing, it looks like they have 11 nuclear ones right now. And these Arctica, these new ones, there's 6 of the 11. So they've basically doubled their icebreaker fleet in recent years. So this is Jeff Nyquist, and with me is David Dubine. Hi, David. How are you doing tonight?
Yeah, doing well. It's good that we're having a second chance to talk on what originally we had both talked about politically, temperatures, weather patterns, food price rises, and it all seems to be hitting exactly what we talked about in the prior interview.
Yeah, we have a lot to talk about because the weather is really showing colder all across the globe. We've got it from Australia, New Zealand, all the way up to Northern Europe now getting hit, Russia, Antarctica having record low temperatures. So we can go over that. And fertilizer shortage, people saying the global food production is going to be down. Real problems in China, problems with, we had the drought in the Western U.S. with food there. And of course, we've got the things going on with the pandemic and people concerned
and the BC,
about
the floods.
The floods in BC, that's right. I had even missed that, and you were following that. And of course, we had another summer of flooding in China. So yeah, we have a lot to talk about. And maybe I'll just introduce this for the listeners. David, you have been writing and doing videos about global climate change, the incorrect kind, global cooling, and the grand solar minimum, which, what would you say, began like a year ago in June?
Well, I think there were some, indicators in 2015, 16, and 17, knowing about solar cycle 25 and 26, how they were going to onset, how quickly it would ramp up or not. And see, that's the whole thing about this solar cycle 25. It was supposed to start off like a screaming hot dog and then scalded dog running to the moon there, and it didn't. It kind of really stayed low coming out of solar cycle 24 into the minimum. And then, as it tried to get more sunspots, more magnetic activity, it's been sputtering. Although the last few weeks with the X flares and all these CMEs that we've seen, it's starting to turn on again, but it was far past the normal amount of time. And the way it's looking, it's not going to get anywhere close to the 120 or 110 or even 100 sunspot average they're talking about. It's going to be closer to probably 75 to 55, somewhere in that range. Huge miss on that part as well coming in. But we'll see. It's not, the solar cycle's not finished yet. We're not even at the solar maximum.
Right. Let's just review for those who are just introduced to this topic. We're talking about the solar cycle and larger cycles. Every about 11 years, the sun's electromagnetic field collapses, reverses and recharges, and that is just the regular solar cycle. And then there's a grand cycle, a grand solar minimum, that is the solar minimum, in which when that happens, the sun's electromagnetic field really doesn't fully reignite. And that electromagnetic field is really important because the sun's electromagnetic field protects the Earth from cosmic rays that strike the oceans, creating clouds, which means more rain, but also a cloudy day is cooler than a sunny day, creating global cooling. Have I got it right?
Yeah, and you forgot also that intense magnetic field is what locks the jet streams and the cloud cells into position. And if you have a wavering of what locks that in place, jet streams will go out of flow, so will the cloud cells. Cloud cells will bunch up on themselves. You got the new cloud layer forming around 18 to 20,000 feet with all the cosmic rays. So now you have 3 factors colliding in instead of 2. Cloud cells are moving to different areas, they're bunching up. Then the jet stream's bunching up on top of that, and you have a whole new cloud layer because of the cosmic rays.
Right. And so you end up with, and now let me just explain for those that don't know, the jet stream, you got these prevailing winds that go from west to east as the earth turns, in this certain direction. The earth turns, the sun sets in the west. And when you have a strong electromagnetic field in the sun, the jet stream just goes from this west to east direction. But then when that electromagnetic field collapses, they get all jiggly. So suddenly you can get really cold Arctic air pulled way down from the north, drawing very, very cold air far, far down, causing freezes and, catastrophic weather on crops. And you can get the other way around where warm air comes up unseasonably from below. And this also can, as you say, lock in clouds, causing droughts and massive flooding in some areas, which is what we've begun to see.
It seems that a lot of those patterns are locking in place too. There's not as much movement in some. Okay, so when you're thinking about the movement within the different layers of the atmosphere, if you're going to get a high pressure cell or a low pressure that gets locked in and almost encircled by other patterns, it's going to lock itself in there, and then things are going to bend around it like a rock in a stream. But they're sort of symbiotic in the way that the pressure pattern will get locked in is because it's almost completely surrounded by all what we're talking in these other jet streams and cloud cells and the different trajectory of where that should move, but it's almost encircling, so it's locking everything on. And then you got to think, is it a magnetic field line termination point that these things might energize themselves over? Because we see in the Volga region of Russia that it seems currently, and I'm just saying currently, that the crop production in the oat areas there are being, well, let's say, interfered with by regional shifts in the weather because there's a stronger electromagnetic or stronger charge coming out along the electromagnetic field lines, or the magnetic field line terminating out above the mesosphere heading back to the sun. Now it's like a light bulb. You've seen those real nice light bulbs in coffee shops where you can turn them up and you put more electricity into it and it glows brighter because there's more vibration in the electrons. Turn it down and it dims a little bit, less vibration, less of a medium moving through. So if you're thinking about the way electricity might move from the earth out to and back to the sun out through our atmosphere, what would that do? If it got more highly charged, it would have an excitation, I guess is the best way to put it, and then cloud cells and clouds in general, weather patterns would behave differently in regional areas, because if there's more of a charge in there, it's going to mean more heating, more evaporation, and things are going to bend around that too.
Yeah.
So it's almost as if you can pick out the magnetic field lines right now where you see these obscure weather patterns keep bending around the same exact areas. So now we can really start to get into the electrics or the electric gravitics, magnetism, and all these things you're talking about, the sun stepping down in its state of output, and then how the earth is responding to having less of that output electrically.
Since 2020, when this sort of was really starting up, we've seen now 2 summers in a row of massive flooding in China. I think they had record flooding this past summer again, which of course wiped out all of the rice growing seasons in whole provinces of China. They're not growing enough food even to feed half the population of China in China. So China has to find that food on the world market. And then you had flooding in Germany this summer, some in parts of France. You've had a drought in the western United States, which really killed a lot of grain production in the United States and corn production. So that's down. In fact, I understand some of the companies that were exporting large amounts of grain to China, they just didn't have much. And China can't pick it up in Europe. And I believe the Russian numbers are down. And weren't you telling me, David, that the crop numbers for the United States for this year, the harvest, is even less than was projected by the FDA?
The USDA.
I mean the USDA, right?
Yeah, that's it. So let me step you back to the Volga region in Russia. What are you hearing about that? Because for your expertise of what you understand about Russia and Russian politics, Central Asia, being connected back to Russia, What are you hearing about the Volga region? Because that's exactly where one of these electromagnetic field lines coming out, literally those lines that you see in the diagrams coming off that spin off the magnetic field lines of the Earth. There's a charge coming out of one of those, sending charge out from the Earth back into space that seems to be becoming more highly charged. And there's so many events around the Czech Republic extending over to that Volga region. And then you look at the crops that are grown under there, the oats and the barley, and they're having massive losses in those places. And then you look at the entire amount of production for Russia of the Volga region, what, 40%? And then you say, wow, if they're going to lose periphery regions plus that region itself and diminished yields, then how much really is going to come out of that area for oats and barley? But you say, oh, it's oats and barley, the wheat, okay, but others don't. So, there's going to be a push and pull of the grains. So what are you hearing on the Volga region? Any kind of news coming out of there?
Well, they had early cold weather, unusually, and of course, North America, we didn't see that, but they saw that in Russia. They had some very cold temperatures suddenly striking in the fall. You probably saw that Beijing even got dusted with snow in October.
And then a blizzard, the earliest blizzard and the highest snowfall ever recorded in November. And how long do Chinese records go back? Their dusting was followed by a blizzard of multiple feet of snow just a week after that.
Yeah, and we're talking October. I'm above the 45th parallel hill. They're below that, and we didn't have snow here until November, until just about the middle of November here in the northern upper Midwest. So there is, and of course, I talked to a fellow from New Zealand yesterday, talking about the unusual. Now it's their spring, and they're getting unusual cold in Australia. They've had unusual cold in Australia over their winter, and they're having it in New Zealand, and it's quite unusual. They're having also some more rainfall. Now this is consistent with the grand solar minimum, is that there's more clouds, so there's more rains, and more rains in the spring. And Australia has been really hit with unusual rains. Australia is a very dry continent, mostly. For Australia to get rains, it's quite unusual.
Yeah, for this period of history.
Right. For this.
But if you go back in and you trace that out, there's been some incredible research synthesizing, I think it was almost 750,000 different data sets across the planet in terms of what you're talking about, rainfall. All they did was measure rainfall patterns there's many ways to do this now. So for those of you who say, well, David and Jeff, they're just talking whatever about this rainfall. Well, you can prove it by going and looking, and there's 5 or 6 different ways that are truly the methods that they look at the amount of rainfall increases or decreases. Then they can map that out by drilling into, say, a high alpine lake. They'll drill down and they'll find all these different layers of deposited sediment. So if you're going to have a huge, gigantic, once in a 1,000-year flood, it's going to bring pebbles and big things like this in on a layer. But if it's just an average rainfall with an average year, you're going to get a bunch of silt and clay.
Yeah.
And going down over the centuries, you can start to measure that out and see exactly how much runoff there was. And then you can look at the stalactites coming out of the caves. Where we're used to icicles, they build fast because it's frozen water in winter, but the cave will do the same thing over thousands of years or hundreds of years, growing year by year stalactites. They just slice those open, and the same thing. The more rainfall it is, the thicker the accumulation for that one year, kind of like a tree ring, which is another one. More,
so
thicker
they can
tree ring,
tell,
higher temperatures, more water.
So they can tell the rainfall from year to year and go back and check.
Oh, you can go back tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, but you have to have the physical substance to be able to check. Mm-hmm. So if the lake only goes so deep before it hits bedrock, that's your termination point. You can't go past that. Or if the stalactite coming out in a cave is only 20,000 years old, that's your limitation point there. You can't guess after.
Glad. You pointed this really good site out, electroverse.net, and I encourage people to go there, and I think you recommended just to read a couple headlines, and you can comment as I go down here. The first one is the global average temperature dropped 0.29 centigrade last month, now sits at just 0.08 centigrade above the 30-year baseline. So tell me what that means.
Well, the IPCC has been talking about limiting, and here, let's go back a little bit. Let's do a historical since I was a kid, talking about global warming, now
Sure.
climate change, now climate extremes, rebranded many times.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a little bit older in a generation and you're not 15 years old or 20 years old, you will have only heard one thing of limiting to 1.5 C rise in temperatures. But when I was a kid, it was limiting to 2.0 C rise in temperatures.
Mm-hmm.
And we were told again and again that sea ice was melting in 2009. There will be no sea ice. The polar bears, there are going to be none. But that was in 2009. Those predictions were made earlier, 2003, 4. So when it came out and there was massive ice in 2009, they just kicked the goalpost. 2013, there'll be no more. 2018, 2000.
And by the way, right now, as you know, there's dozens of ships trapped in the Barents Sea in the sea ice. They're trapped, and even the icebreakers are having trouble getting to them.
Oh, I didn't know that, because I know there's sent several icebreakers out as a rescue mission to get those ships trapped in ice this early, unexpected, fastest growing. It's almost like, I wouldn't say a day after tomorrow event, but the way that it wasn't totally ice, it was sort of what you consider slush ice in the ocean floshing around, but then something hit it and it turned into ice instantly.
Right.
Across that entire region and froze all those ships in all at the same time. So rescuing one ship's one thing, but hey, there's 20 ships, Mayday, Pan, we're stuck in ice.
Yeah, and I think the number's above 30 the last I checked that are stuck out there.
And I'll go get them all with 2 icebreakers.
Yeah, when you read, I was always big on the Arctic explorers. So what happened, you know, the famous expedition of Sir Ernest Shackleton, their ship went down. They were going to go to the South Pole, and they were going through that slushy stuff, and all of a sudden it hardened up and the ship was trapped. And then it got harder and thicker until it crushed the hull of the ship. And then they were stuck on the ice, right? And they didn't have a ship. And they were kind of like, you know, Robinson Crusoe. They were living on penguins and stuff, anything they could catch out there for almost 2 years, I think, before they got to be rescued. But
can I ask a question, Jeff?
Yeah.
What was the what era was that? Do you remember? I know the story, but I can't remember the year.
Before they came in, right after, you remember, I think it was 1911, 1912. The Scott and Amundsen were racing for the pole. And Scott was the British captain, naval captain, who was taking a British expedition, and they were trying to reach the South Pole. He used Shetland ponies and not dogs. And then Amundsen, the famous Arctic explorer, came down on the other side of Antarctica with dogs. And his trick was to eat the dogs on the way back, because the dogs would pull their supplies, but they'd need less supplies and it was fresh meat, so they wouldn't get scurvy. So Amundsen, and of course everybody said he was cruel to animals, and he beat Scott to the pole. But Scott famously, his polar party died on the way back. They died of scurvy, actually, they believe now. And so you had
lemons, not dogs.
What's that?
Limes, not dogs. Limeys. That's how the whole.
Limey,
right?
They
brought the limes with them on the ships over so they wouldn't get scurvy, vitamin C deficiencies. Eat the limes. Look for the trail of limes. Oh, the British are here.
Yeah. The Norwegian Amundsen beat him to the pole and got back alive, but his party did not. Well, of course, they didn't have dogs because their Shetland ponies died early. The men were pulling their sleds. So imagine, the men were pulling their own supplies, their sleds. It's a tragic story, the polar expedition, but Shackleton had led an attempt to reach the South Pole earlier that failed, that Scott was on. They didn't make it. They turned back to save the men. But Shackleton went down there after, I think it was 1913, but I'm not remembering. It was before World War I, because they got stuck there. The first beginning of World War I started when they were stuck on the ice. And that was when Shackleton's expedition was. So getting stuck on that ice, you cannot predict. This weather can be unpredictable. If that cold comes in, if those ice flows come in and it solidifies, this is how a ship gets trapped. And this is what's happening with the Arctic now. And of course, the Russians knew it, because in the last decade, the Russians had commissioned the building of an unprecedented number of new icebreakers. And they have nuclear icebreakers with icebreakers with nuclear engines. And, if the Russians didn't believe that the ice was coming back, why would they be building icebreakers? The ice was going to go away.
Yeah, 2 things on that. the nuclear powered icebreaker, if it were going to run upriver and there were towns out of power, could it just dock up and they could plug into it and have power for a town at the same time that they're clearing ice going up and down? Just a random question.
It
That's the
might,
way my mind thinks,
I
though.
mean, any nuclear power plant, if it has those inputs, could probably be used to plug in and generate power off ship if they had the equipment, the cords and stuff. It's possible. And in fact, they might even be able to use it to bring heat onto another ship. I mean, an icebreaker can be kind of like a rescue ship, but I don't really know. I think the nuclear engine is part of how the icebreaker works to generate the heat needed to help melt the ice in front of the ship in case, so the icebreaker itself doesn't get stuck. But I've never really studied the actual design of the Russian icebreakers. I know that they're pretty sophisticated, and they're building up their fleet of icebreakers. And as you know, Russia has the longest Arctic coastline with many ports up there, and they're not all ice-free all the time. In this last 30 years of more warming weather, many of them, there's been unprecedented. That northern passage through the Arctic Sea, through the coast of the former Soviet Union of Russia and Siberia, that has been free at times for ships to go all the way through to the Pacific. But generally, I mean, there was a discussion, the Russians' main fleet, their biggest military fleet is out of Murmansk, which is right at the top of the Kola Peninsula. It's right near where Finland and Norway and Russia kind of come together up there. And that warm current that comes through the Atlantic comes up there and warms that. So it's ice free most of the time. That port of Murmansk is generally ice free. And that's where they base their Navy. And they were talking a couple of years ago about, could they bring their Navy across the Arctic to the Bering Strait to Alaska to help out China in a military emergency? And of course, that was being discussed in their military press. And it's the idea of moving an entire military fleet through that area. But of course, there's the danger that your fleet gets stuck, and that's a fleet has to move. If it's fighting, if it's stuck in the ice, it could be destroyed. And so they were talking about, having icebreakers for that purpose as well. And having the Arctic ice coming back. Now, is it your understanding, David, that the last couple of years, the ice in the Arctic has been getting larger during the winters, has been, has it been expanding the Arctic ice?
Well, I can't remember off the exact top of my head, but anybody who wants to do the research to verify what we're talking about can go to NSIDC. That's a National Snow Ice Data Center. And they have to within a couple hundred square kilometers or even more, tuned in than that, how much it is at the low melt point and what day it terminated at the melt point and started to regain ice through the last 30 years. So you can start to look at it yourself. But yes, as a general, over the last 3 years, it started to rebound on the ice, which makes me wonder. And I wanted to go back to the icebreaker point for a second here. But this is the way my mind's working. All right, a nuclear powered vessel has a power plant on it. So
right.
If you're clearing the river at the same time and you knew there were 7 towns that you needed to go up to, could you put them on rolling brownouts or blackouts, knowing that in 7 days the ship's going to return and plug in and they can recharge everything, or they can have power for a full, say, 12, 15, 18 hours until that ship continues to the next destination upriver in an emergency situation? You would know, and that would give you so much hope that you would have electricity full for one full day once a week versus being permanently out of power. Like, what? How would that change your mind frame? And are they thinking the same way? All right, maybe there's 2 icebreakers that follow, and every 3rd day you get full power to be able. And how many? You said an absurd amount of icebreakers, and how many could be retooled to do the same thing on smaller fleets to go up the rivers? Because there's an enormous amount of large cities on the rivers in Russia. So what if it were to be, a new way to power and keep trade open at that time? And then the icebreakers, when they're not in service or being repaired, they could just sit at a destination more remotely and power the thing all through the summer.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you an example. Now,
Or is that too outlandish to think like that?
well, let's talk about the newest, fanciest Russian icebreaker. It's called the Arctica, Arktika, and you can look it up online. And it's their newest nuclear powered icebreaker in decades. And of course Russia has the largest fleet of icebreaking ships in the world. It makes sense. They have the largest Arctic coastline, and it's capable of smashing through ice that's nearly 10 feet thick. Imagine that. 10 feet thick of ice. Millions of Russians live above the Arctic Circle. They've got the largest population above the Arctic Circle of anybody. I mean, that's huge. I mean, in Scandinavia, there's not even that many people. In Alaska and northern Canada, there's even less people living above the Arctic Circle. So Russia has this very large population, and they depend a lot of times, as you say, there's rivers in Siberia, and there's also the sea, and so this is from Popular Mechanics. The icebreaker itself, it's blue. Okay, let's see if they give the tonnage. It's got a 300-ton electric motors connected to the nuclear power. Wow, 300-ton electric motors. You can imagine smashing through 10 feet of ice. And yes, it looks like it's on a river here in one of the pictures. And I'm sorry, okay, it's 560 feet long, 112 feet wide, and it's 33,000 tons in the water. It's got a low length to beam ratio, a very high superstructure, making for it's a stout-looking ship, it is. And it's got an RITM 200 nuclear reactor it does 175 megawatts of power. That gives you an idea of what this thing can do. And by comparison, the USS Gerald Ford, which is an aircraft carrier, that's our newest aircraft carrier, displaces 100,000 tons, which is 3 times the size, and is powered by a generator that does 100 megawatts. So this thing does almost twice as much as the USS Gerald Ford in its engine that it generates. Isn't that interesting? So this nuclear-powered icebreaker, though it's the tonnage of an aircraft carrier, I mean, it just doesn't look as long, but it's pretty wide. But it's got to be a very heavy ship underneath. 175 megawatts. That's incredible.
See, in my mind, that's an overbuild to provide extra power offshore
right,
if it docks off somewhere versus what the needs are on the ship itself.
Now they tell you how it works here. It does its job by bearing down on the ice using strong holes to crack the ice from above. It can smash through, like we said, 10 feet of hull ice. It's got a reinforced double steel hull. It's fascinating. So this gives you an idea of what they do, and of course this article depicts it as they're exploiting the warming Arctic, right? They have to put that in there, but it's really not. That's kind of hiding the fact. Right?
The narrative comes in many forms, doesn't it?
It does. You can say, oh, we're building more icebreakers because now we have access to more. No, you see, it's getting colder because it's getting warmer. That's what they've got. And of course,
now give me more carbon taxes.
Gosh, I mean, looking at the picture, depending on, they've got there's a number of, I think the ship was built in St. Petersburg shipyards. And then they have, how many nuclear powered icebreakers have been built in Russia? They've got 10 civilian ones built, and one is a container ship with an ice-breaking bow. 6 nuclear powered of the Arctica class. So there's 6 of these Arctica class ones built in the Baltic shipyard in St. Petersburg. My goodness.
That's a lot of movable power, isn't it? If you're starting to think that direction of knowing where this grand solar minimum is going to take us with supply lines getting cut off on a natural fashion, because when the second magnetic field starts to really pound the Earth here in 2023, we should see some significant effects as that field really starts to lock in Q2 of 2022 coming up next year. And as that does, we're going to get a lot of things on the surface of the Earth cracks, sinkholes, slippage, uplift. these types of things that are going to damage the infrastructure that's riding on top of that very thin veneer of the very top of the crust here, called the top few feet of the earth that we walk on, is going to get disrupted down to about, I would say the top 2 miles of the crust would have a lot of effects. So if you already know that fiber optic cables will get pulled enough where they would snap, and electric lines, I know there's some elasticity built into that, but if you're going to think about something moving half a mile or a quarter mile snap, okay, they're already pre-planning in that they're going to need to have movable power everywhere to still have some semblance of society, knowing that what we consider traditional infrastructure might have to shift drastically in the way you deliver power or goods to cities if the above ground conduits aren't working. What's your plan B and then plan C?
Now, Russia has a lot of other non-nuclear icebreakers, but looking here on this thing, it looks like they have 11 nuclear ones right now. And these Arctica, these new ones, there's 6 of the 11. So they've basically doubled their icebreaker fleet.